Well, welcome back, everyone. I'd like to wrap up this series of lectures about cohort studies by just reviewing some of the major advantages and disadvantages of cohort studies. So here are some of the strengths of cohort studies. And again, if you want, think about the Framingham Heart Study. Think about the study whose data we've been using in this course as an example of a cohort study. What are the strengths of the Framingham cohort study? Well, first of all, from a cohort study, you're able to measure multiple outcomes of a single exposure. You can see, for example, whether smoking increases your risk or rate of dying, increases risk and rate of developing cardiovascular disease, or maybe just coronary heart disease, or maybe just stroke. Once you enroll these people and classify them as smokers and non-smokers and start following them over time, you can see different types of outcomes occurring: mortality, heart disease, stroke, or whatever. Okay? That's one of the strengths. Another nice aspect or characteristic of a cohort study is the time relationship. What came first, the chicken or the egg, is easier to determine. Remember the cross-sectional studies. If you find a relationship between smoking status and the existence of coronary heart disease at one point in time, you might not know whether that association is due to the fact that smoking is influencing whether a person develops heart disease or not, or whether the development of heart disease influences whether a person's a smoker or not, because everything is measured at one point in time. But in a cohort study, the exposure status is measured at one point in time, people are followed into the future, and outcomes are determined at another point in time. So if we find an association in a cohort study, it's easier for us to argue that it's the exposure causing the outcome, not the opposite, which might be a possibility in a cross-sectional study. So that's another strength of a cohort study. Another strength, if you're doing a prospective cohort study, you have better control on what data is being collected, how it's being collected, when it's being collected. So therefore, you have less potential for biases in a prospective cohort study than you might have in some other study designs. For example, the Framingham Heart Study makes the decision that every 2 years people come to testing centers to have their outcomes measured. And they're measured in a very systematic manner, so they have good control over the quality and the quantity of data that's being collected. If you were doing a retrospective cohort study, you're relying on data that was collected in the past, and therefore you have less control over the quality and the quantity. And then finally, cohort studies allow us to measure incidence directly. We can measure incidence of heart disease, cumulative incidence or incidence rates among smokers, among non-smokers. We can compare them by calculating risk ratios or rate ratios. So in a cohort study, we have the ability not just to measure the association between a risk factor and an outcome. We can measure exposure-specific risks or rates. We can measure the risk of heart disease among smokers or the rate of developing heart disease among smokers and also among non-smokers. The next series of lectures following this will talk about a different study design, a case-control study design, and we'll see that in that study design we can measure associations between risk factors and outcomes. We can estimate maybe risk ratios or rate ratios, but we cannot measure risks and rates specifically among the exposed and the non-exposed group. But we can do that in cohort studies. Those are all positive attributes, strengths of cohort studies. But like any study, it has some limitations. First of all, if you're measuring a rare disease, a disease that doesn't happen very often among people, you're going to have to either measure lots of people in your cohort study to get enough cases of this rare disease, or you might have to follow people for long periods of time to give people enough time for developing this rare outcome and to have enough of the cases of this rare outcome to analyze in your data set. So cohort studies might not be efficient, they might be inefficient for developing outcomes that are rare, don't happen that often among anything but very large populations. If you're doing a prospective cohort study, and again, think of Framingham, think of following people for the targeted period of 20 years, asking people to come back to your testing center every 2 years, that's going to cost time and that's going to cost money. You're going to have to wait for these outcomes to occur to be able to see if more outcomes happen among the smokers than among the non-smokers. You have to pay the research staff for monitoring these test centers for which people come to every 2 years. So it's very expensive in terms of time and also in terms of cost utilization. Well, you might be able to resolve that by doing retrospective studies, retrospective case control studies where you use data that's already been collected by somebody else and to build a cohort that existed in the past. Follow them through that historical data to see who develops outcomes. Well, you resolve the problem of timing, but now you have to rely on the quality of the data and the quantity of the data. You have to rely on the fact that data was collected in the past by somebody else, not to answer your research question, but for an entirely different reason, and you're hoping now to use that data to answer your research question. So it requires having adequate records, adequate data on individuals. And then finally, for any type of study, we always worry about these alternative explanations of bias, confounding, and chance. And for cohort studies, one of the biggest problems, especially for studies that are following people for long periods of time, is what do you do with these losses to follow-up? There are analytical ways, incidence rates, survival analysis that you'll be learning from Marcello in this class that allow you to take the data from a cohort study where you have losses to follow up and measure incidence and measure rate ratios or risk ratios. But the assumptions of all those calculations is that the reason for being lost is not due to the risk of developing your outcome. And if that's a problem, if that's likely in your cohort study, you have a potential for bias. So those are some of the strengths, those are some of the limitations of cohort studies. We as epidemiologists weigh the strengths and limitations of every potential study design against other potential study designs to choose the best study design to answer a particular research question. And so far we've talked about cross-sectional studies, we've talked about experimental studies, and now we've talked about cohort studies. Next time we talk about a fourth class of study design, case control studies. But before we do that, I want to talk about another very well-known, very famous cohort study that's being run out of this institution, out of the Harvard School of Public Health. It's known as the Nurses' Health Study. And next time I'm going to ask the principal investigator, one of my colleagues, to give a short lecture on the history of the Nurses' Health Study, how it works, and maybe some of the results that they found. So you could compare that design, the Nurses' Health Study, to the design that was used in the Framingham Heart Study to get some appreciation of the strengths and potential limitations of cohort studies and how investigators try to address those limitations. So that'll be the next time we get together. See you then.